So you are more and more getting into this new Leçon de mode, which is the number 24 already. And we are very happy to welcome everybody for this new session, which is totally new for us, because for the first time we do it in English. And for the first time we're doing it with an English speaker living in England. So it's a new start, and I hope you will enjoy this talk about masculinity. So just to say a few words about James, our speaker of tonight, is specialized in diversity and inclusion, and we've asked him to talk about masculinity. So you all know that at the moment we have an exhibition at the museum which is about masculinity, and I hope you've seen it. You still have more than a month to see this exhibition, and we are living now in a moment where there are a lot of questions about gender identity, the way we are seeing what femininity is, masculinity is, and tonight we're gonna hear James talking about what is masculinity nowadays. How do people see what masculinity is? And of course, after the talk, you will have a chance to questions and ask questions to James. So if you have questions, you can ask your question in French in the Q&A or in English. If it's in French, no problem. I will translate and ask the questions to James. So I will give him the floor, and I hope you will enjoy his talk about masculinity. So James, here's your turn.
Thank you. Good evening. My name is James Brandon, and I'm here today from Progressive Inclusion. And it is my absolute pleasure to be speaking with you all tonight. The title of my talk tonight is, how does our perspective value or devalue masculinity? But before I start, I just wanted to touch on a few things. It would be remiss of me not to recognize the current circumstances that keep us apart. And no, I do not mean Brexit. The last year has been difficult, and I hope that everyone attending this call tonight is thriving in arduous circumstance. I look forward to the day when events like this can once again be in a place that brings us together. Whilst the personal cost for all of us has been significant, the impact on the cultural sector is something that we cannot undervalue. The impact of reduced tourism and the delicate funding models that the sector has faced for decades means we are at a crucial turning point. Can we really continue to operate as we have, or is this a time of innovation, modernization, and a new future? The impact of this pandemic is going to be felt for at least a generation. From a reduced workforce to a reduced program, to our students and young professionals struggling to access the culture making that is available. I applaud the sector for its response to digitalization, which brings us here together this evening. Attending events in a digital space is something that's very different for all of us, but I hope that we can use the technology today to create a thriving conversation that can draw upon the different themes that I'm going to introduce. As we said, there is the opportunity to use the Q&A box at any point during today, and there's loads of time at the end of my speech for us to be looking at those questions. And those questions can be about what I talked about today, or they could be about anything that you might want to ask me. To give us a quick practice run in there, why not use it now telling us where you're from? I appreciate that this is not the warmest start to the session talking about this pandemic, but I feel it's important to recognize the context we're in. Tonight, though, I am hoping to distract you from the external environment with a bit of a deep dive into some interesting concepts that underlie masculinity. But before I start, I have a secret. It's a secret I'm going to share with you. I really, really hope that I can trust you with it. I am a rugby player. Now, if you saw me in the flesh, as we were expected to do this evening, you might not be surprised by this, given my size, my shape, and my rugged good looks. Here's this picture to prove it. I feel that I might be scaring the person on the floor, but hopefully I'm not scaring you tonight. But this image does set out today what I want to talk about, and in particular the tone, dominance, hypermasculinity, and the question if this image is masculine or if it's really me in that picture who is masculine. As I share with you that I'm also a gay man, does this change your perception of me? The image or the masculinity it might portray? So what does this gay rugby player have to say about culture and masculinity? Well, for over 15 years, I've operated in a range of public spaces. I started out in an LGBT mental health center. I moved to work across sport, delivering award-winning programs, and the first ever Pride House at Commonwealth Games. Most recently, I led on diversity programs at Tate art galleries in London. My practice has always been to place a lens of community inclusion on civic spaces, asking the questions about who is welcomed in a space and who is excluded, who is represented and who is often ignored. How do we change or build the cultures of today and the future? And have we already started too late to think about that? I was approached over a year ago to consider speaking at an event in and around this exhibition, even before we knew what the words Corona and COVID-19 were. And the reason I think I was approached is that my experience as both working in hyper-masculine spaces and having worked in cultural organizations gives me a space to open up debate about challenges of masculinity in the institution. My intent today is to provoke diverse thinking about this issue and to take a moment to step outside of our own boxes and make considerations for our role as cultural makers in perpetuating, performing, and maybe including or excluding masculinity in everything we do. Today is a session of provocations. It's a moment to consider things slightly differently, and there's no pressure to come to a resolution. My aim today is absolutely not to create consensus or agreement. I would like to spark debate. So I hope that you at times will absolutely disagree with me. We have loads of time at the end of today to take questions, so do use the chat box and the Q&A to log them. And as Olivia said, they can be asked in French or in English, and we will resolve to answer them. Before I start, I want to offer up some definitions for the language that I might use today. Many of you will have your own definitions, but just to provide clarity, this is my reference point for my views today. Gender. Often expressed in terms of masculinity and femininity, gender is largely culturally determined and is assumed from the sex assigned at birth. Gender expression. How a person chooses to outwardly express their gender within the context of societal expectations of gender. A person who does not conform to societal expectations of gender may not, however, identify as trans or transgender. Masculinity. Characteristics, conditions, behaviors, and expectation that are often attributed to men or assessed as if of male qualities. Sometimes they can be viewed as destructive or constructive acts. Non-binary, an umbrella term for people whose gender identity doesn't sit comfortably with man or woman. Non-binary identities are varied and can include people who identify with some aspects of binary identities, while others reject them entirely. Queer. Queer is a term used by those wanting to reject specific labels of romantic orientation, sexual orientation, and/or gender identity. It can also be a way of rejecting the perceived norms already found within the LGBT community, including racism, sizeism, ableism. Although some LGBT people view the word as a slur, it was reclaimed in the late 80s by the queer community who have embraced it. I'm going to come back to this word when I talk about an exhibition that I worked on called Queer British Art. And we're going to talk particularly about how one word can have such different definitions for different parts, different age and generations of a community. However, my starting point for today is to focus on the presence of masculinity in the sporting theatre. In particular, how sport constructs heterosexual masculinity as the dominant operandi. When sports require physicality, this becomes heightened into an almost hyper-masculine environment. My sport is rugby, and this is a great example to start from of the nature of physical dominance in the sporting field. To have a successful team in rugby, you must build a team of different bodies. Some short, some tall, some large, some slim, some slow and powerful, and some fast and quick. However, the essence of the game is for one side to dominate another. This is through violent acts of tackling, rucking, scrumming. And for those who don't know what that means, it's basically very big men throwing themselves at each other. Sociologists have recognized that there is various forms of masculinity found among different cultures. There is no one way of being masculine, but different environments, contexts, and platforms might require masculinity to demonstrate itself in different ways. If we consider these different spaces, this might show this. If we think about the difference between the home and the office, how does masculinity be observed in qualities of male and female leaders? Or successful and unsuccessful leaders? Or how do we think or perceive to think it operates in a sports stadium versus an art gallery? If the framework for how masculinity is observed depends on the situation and context, then this may also suggest that not all masculinity is treated equally. This then should make us consider the concept of hegemony, developed by Antonio Gramsci in 1971. Hegemony refers to how a dominant or ruling class hold on to its position whilst also securing the acceptance from those below. It also is suggested that hegemony is fully realized when the subordinate feels their place is natural. Examples of this can be seen in cultures when a woman believes she should be subservient to a man, a sexist society, or a gay man does not believe they deserve the same rights as a straight man, a heterosexist society. It is why hegemony is a key concept relating to the oppression of many marginalized groups. This may in fact go in some way to explain why the hyper-masculine nature of sport has held an image of homophobia and exclusion. From crowds chanting homophobic slurs or abuse in the stands, to coaches shouting terms like "don't run like a girl," or "fag," or "gay," or a lack of visible out gay role models in sport. It shows that there is an acceptable way to behave and perform. In fact, in sport, a hegemonic approach suggests that it's not enough to be masculine, but to be actively homophobic as a vehicle to cast off aspersions of being unmasculine. By being an active, dominant participant, this solidifies the label of being masculine. You can take this further to say that if an environment requires you to perform as masculine, and not behaving this way can lead to punishment and exclusion. If one, for instance, shows emotion, compassion, vulnerability, weakness, or fear, you may be risked being labeled as less than ideal in that situation. How many times have we heard the story, boys don't cry? Or the time when we've seen sitcoms show male groups where somebody starts to talk about something a little bit more emotional and everybody becomes uncomfortable. This is the performance that we operate around masculine spaces. And this has then become the self-fulfilling nature of institutions such as sport. It is valued certain qualities, certain behaviors, and certain performances over and above just the athletic prowess. I play within a gay inclusive team. Not long ago in 2012, Brussels held the European tournament for LGBT gay inclusive rugby clubs across Europe. And it was phenomenal to see that these spaces where men are competing at a very high level of rugby, but are only competing in these teams because they have been exited or made to feel less than in teams in which they've been in the past, whether those have been heteronormative teams or straight teams or normal teams, and I put the big exclamation marks around that word. But there is a reason why these spaces have become important. You can argue that this has become a performance. To be successful is to behave consciously in this environment. But what does this analysis of sport provide to our view of other institutions? Before I draw on the discussion of the role of culture in determining masculinity, I wanted to reflect on the word of Judith Butler, as I believe their work adds a unique lens to this debate. Judith Butler is a renowned feminist, anthropologist, and linguist, and has led the ways of exploring how our language and behavior, and more importantly, our gender identity, is performative. They suggest that gender is in no way a stable entity, but from which any point is fixed. But it's actually formed through a series of repeated acts. The acts start from birth and are formed from the experience of our communities, our institutions, and societal norms. Take, for example, a clothing store. Your whole life, as you've entered a clothing store, you are told to turn left for men's clothes and turn right for women's clothes. This comes to the point where we maybe are conditioned to look for the section that affirms our gender or supports our gender expression. But are we actually making those selections about the clothing, or are they made for us? At this day, I'd like to tell a story about a well-known clothing store who used to sell a blue jumper. There was no difference in this blue jumper. It was no tailoring, normal sizing, but on one side of the store, it was labeled a men's jumper, and on another, a women's jumper. I bet you can imagine on which side it costs £2 more. In a sporting context, if we have observed throughout our lives a hyper-masculine approach, a hegemonic approach, we learn that this is the behavior that we must adopt, and anything less than this is no longer an acceptable performance. Butler's words themselves highlight this. Discrete gender is part of what humanizes. Discrete gender is part of what humanizes individuals within contemporary culture. Indeed, those who fail to do their gender right are regularly punished. As the exhibition here at the Fashion and Lace Museum has been exploring, one act of that performance is the outward expression of our gender or masculinity. And a provocation here is the role of fashion in this performance. More complex is the role of fashion in determining what is and what is not masculine, or what does and what does not express someone's gender. By providing the label of something to be masculine or not labeling it masculine, do we in fact make it that way? So far, I've introduced the concept of hegemony and that of performative gender. I want to now turn my attention to the cultural institution. Until very recently, I was the diversity inclusion manager at Tate art galleries, and my role spanned across 4 art galleries in London, Liverpool, and St. Ives. During my tenure, I worked on a range of exhibitions, workforce strategies, and audience engagement programs, but including the exhibitions Queer British Art 1861 to 1967, Aubrey Beardsley, and Keith Haring, which I believe came to Beaux-Arts in 2020, one of their most successful exhibitions, even with the backdrop of the pandemic. My role at times was to consider how we told stories and the language that we might use if this is to represent modern communities or if they create exclusion. The example I will draw upon closely is Queer British Art. I arrived in Tate in early 2017 with this show scheduled for that summer. The show had been driven really strongly by an internal staff network representing the queer community. A show whose intent was to represent a community often talked about, but noticeably missing from institutional walls. However, the show's fundamental question posed a huge amount of challenges, but namely, what is queer art? This is why I want to focus on this, because much like a rugby team, where there is a performance that leads to a culture of hypermasculinity, cultural institutions have their own performances of tagging, collecting, sorting, and displaying. Often we have processes that overlaid an exhibition, making sure that they're standardized or they're marketed, or we're going to have the right audiences there who are going to make the money. And the ability of our museums to see things differently has to come from a diversity within its workforce. I'm sure it is of no surprise to anyone who's on this call tonight that workforces found in museums are predominantly cisgender. That is, their gender identity is the same as their sex they were assigned at birth, white, and heteronormative. Whilst the presence of queer people in the workforce is well represented, these communities are still often white and cis-dominated. So what does this mean then for cultural institutions who are responding to the call to represent queer communities more intently from audiences, from more younger audiences, and from more visible audiences who have access to social media and to other areas, challenging what it means to be making culture? In fact, Queer British Art, for is an example of having to deal with questions like, is this a risk or a gamble to be doing this? Is it really something new? Are we going far enough with what we're doing here? For queer British art, some of the first challenges were around the selection of images, objects, and other storytelling. What parameters do you set for what is queer British art? Is it that the content that is queer? Is it the artist who is queer? Is it the sitters in the portrait? Or is it none of these and is actually about objects that the queer community hold value to? In reality, it is all of these things. One of my favorite feedback we received before the show was, why was Kylie Minogue's gold hot pants not included in the exhibition? However, who is it that gets to tag these objects as queer? Ultimately, that is the institution's role. But by tagging it in this way, do we queer the object and therefore continue to perpetuate this performance? The Masculinities exhibition is no different. It's made selections, descriptions, wall panels that might reiterate or challenge the concept of masculinity. The artists also have an important role to play. The agency of an artist, in particular when we discuss issues of sexuality and gender, is often a privilege within the institutional context. Many artists actively push back from labels such as women artists, Black artists, queer artists, instead pushing simply to be known as artist and not othered by labels of their identity. Especially when these same labels are not applied to the more dominant group of white men. Yet as more pressure comes from communities to see themselves in our civic spaces, to challenge our colonial history, and to reduce marginalization in institutions, we have to do something to intently tag this work. So here are 3 tips from me in how to make this happen, and are actions that we have taken in a range of shows that I've worked or advised on. Center lived experience in your approach. Your project should have at least some representation from the communities that you're talking to or engaging with. You should have a strong partnership and clear methods and criteria for selections that are co-developed. And if I would say anything, consult, consult, consult. Define your language really early in any exhibition project plan. If you're talking, if it might be a solo show about an artist who may have identified as queer, it could be that they have a disability, that they have a story. Define the language in which you are going to use and operate it, and share that among the whole project group, your curators, your interpreters, your press, your marketing teams, your front of house teams, so that everybody is on the same page about what you mean when you're using this language. Thirdly, use the language of the individuals and communities that define themselves. Use their voice in the space. Too often the institution might overlay language to define an individual, to make sure it fits within our current way of working or our thinking or in our terminology. During Queer British Art and many exhibitions since, we researched the language artists use through letters, statements, and articles. We named sitters on equal weighting with the artists, and we brought in the voice of the queer community into our interpretation text, asking them to respond. The show was a surprising to some success, with 160% against targets in both income and attendance. And for Tate Britain, over 60% of that audience was under 30. We've seen this replicated in other artists where a queer narrative has been centered. Not only this, across London, we have seen exhibitions that have centered queer communities, Black and Asian communities, disabled communities, really see huge groups turn out and come and see themselves in those spaces. It is time to challenge the hegemony. So my final thought to share with you. I watched a webinar recently where there were these three images. And the speaker, this is no comment on the speaker or person, but they did use the turn of phrase, a man in a dress. With everything we have thought about tonight, where has the determination that a dress is not for men come from? Or in that turn of phrase, there is somewhat othering of it in its nature. Consider our own responses when we observe someone expressing their identity in clothing we have been conditioned to think is different. Young people in particular are challenging these concepts of gender, the structures that determine masculinity and femininity, and they are doing it at pace and at speed. So before we enter some time for questions, I leave you with 3 provocations, and I hope I've provoked you a lot today to get lots of questions in the box. How can we challenge hegemony in building our museums? How can we make sure that we are acknowledging the dominant forces and we are not making sure that that is natural and accepted and we're challenging it? How can we create a new performance around terms like masculinity and femininity and gender and sexuality and race? How can we challenge ourselves to center marginalized communities more authentically? So I hope today that I've given you lots to think about and I've provoked you against those 3 questions. It's been a real pleasure to offer my thoughts. And now I just want to say a big thank you. And we'll hand over to Olivier for the Q&A.
Thank you, James, for all these explanations, and I'm pretty sure people have a lot of things to think about. And in terms of question, we have someone saying, "Hi, James, what's your opinion on gender-neutral clothing? Is it a step forward or just another way of labeling and possibly gendering objects?" So I have to say this was a question I wanted to ask you too. And I'm curious to hear what you think about that.
Yeah, it's a great question. So I think I touched upon it in my talk. There is that clothing is only being labeled male and female because somebody has labeled it male and female. So when a clothing is not being labeled non-binary as a non-binary, what we need to get to a stage is where if you would like to go and find a blue jumper, we go to a store and you're looking for blue jumpers. And it shouldn't matter. That's the key issue here, is that actually we are conditioned to look in a store for the men's blue jumper or the women's blue jumper. And we're not conditioned to just go and search for the blue jumper. Now that is a utopia that is in the future, but I do think that large department stores, large stores that have lots of different brands in different spaces, they are starting to think about this. And that is often driven by the consumer. We often are seeing this, if you take something like children's toys, where we've seen the damaging impact of how the toys that are bought for girls and the toys that are bought for boys, and the difference it happens in their brains and how they develop their brains, where boys are given much more problem solving, construction, and girls are given more kind of, they're less challenging toys. And we've seen that the research shows that means that brains develop and respond differently. But that's always because we have this idea of what is a boy's toy and what's a girl's toy. And that is really being challenged. What's really exciting about that is being challenged. More and more we're seeing parents standing up for this right to say, well, if my child wants to play with a doll, they should just play with a doll. It's just a toy. We're not worrying about, oh, what are these structures that come with that? And I think similarly in clothing, I think it may feel a bit clunky, and clunky, I mean like rough at the moment, because we are moving from such what has been hundreds of years of this is where the men's clothing is and this is where the women's clothing is, or this is where you get yours tailored, this is what the shapes look like, to a position where in 20 years time, you know, it might not be tomorrow, but in 20 years time, you will just go to a shop like Uniqlo and you're going to go and find a blue shirt or a blue jumper, and that's what you're going to be looking for.
So while you were talking about, I was thinking about department stores and magazines and fashion presentations. You were talking about department stores, and I think they've been quite reactive about all those questions because they have space and they can integrate new brands or new collection for existing brands corresponding to those new needs. But when you think about magazines, for example, there is so far, I don't know any no gender magazines. You've got male magazines, female magazines, women's magazines, men's magazines, but there's no gender magazine, I would say, so far. The system, the industry is very rigid in terms of publishing and organizing things, I would say.
Yeah, it is very interesting, and actually, that is a difficulty because where does the leadership come from in this area? And you know, if the fashion magazines were setting the trends and setting the leadership on that, the stores are going to follow, and the clothing stores will follow that. And the consumer will want to consume differently. I think we are seeing a slow kind of shift. We have seen this last year, Billy Porter, Vanity Fair America. We have seen trans models. We've seen there has always been within fashion this androgyny that has been sort of talked about as a solution to gender for years. But you know, are we seeing the significant step change, as you say, of breaking down that gender? Not yet, but I do think it's coming, and I think it's going to be generationally, it's going to be challenging because a younger generation today are not wanting that anymore. You know, we know that, you know, that what they want is, we did a study last year where we did some work and to respond to an exhibition, and we got this very clear generational divide where sort of an older generation were looking more for, I just wanted to feel like I've normalized into this position, I'm assimilated here, I can see myself in normal domestic situations, or I'm, you know, whereas young people, younger varying age groups were saying, no, I want really specificity, I want to see responsibility, I want to see that you have recognized me as an individual, that you've asked me what I want to create this exhibition. And that's generations within a community have got such different views. It's going to continue, but culture is, the good thing about culture, which is different to any other sector, is that it's got the space to have the difficult conversations. And I think that's what makes it harder for us, because in culture it is, we have our history, as we all will know what those histories are, but we want to be striving for more, but we also have this challenge of the future and trying to set culture for the future. But it allows us to be in this very knot, this big, huge knot that we're trying to untie that no one else has the privilege to do. But yeah, I think coming back to your point, I think anywhere that continues to dig in on this idea of men and women having separate needs and not seeing that we are coming together and together slowly but surely. In sport at the moment, in rugby, we have a huge issue, to give you a different lens, around people who have transitioned and which gender they might play their sport, because they use the term gender affected. So what do you put into place? Do you put biological markers to say, well, if you meet this, you can come and play on this team, but if you don't, you're not allowed to play? what does that mean for our future? So I think that so many areas are, the genders are coming together rather than pulling apart. They're coming together more and more to form these gray areas which people are trying to work through and find representation. And it's a debate and discourse that's challenging for lots of people.
So one of our viewer has a question about, is there a correct transition period or method possible towards a non-binary period? What do you think about it?
Can you repeat the question, sorry?
So is there a correct transition period or method possible towards a non-binary period? So we are in a binary period at the moment. We should go to a non-binary period, but what would be the correct transition method to go from the place we know right now to this new place to maybe go?
I think this is the $1 million question, because if we knew how to transition to that, either a third gender representation or this idea where gender is not binary, we'd already be there. But actually it gets very complicated, because if we take something like feminism and the advancement of human rights for women, that has been a very hard fought process for over, at least 100 years, if not longer, where women have, if we think about that hegemony piece that I was talking about, have had to really fight tooth and nail to be identified, to be seen, to be held as a gender that has parity. And even to today, we still are tackling pay gaps where women aren't paid the same as men, representation in leadership where women aren't attached as men. And actually, I started sort of talked a bit slightly in my speech there around, women in leadership are having to have masculine traits to be seen as good women in leadership. And so that is a complicating factor of women say, well, actually we fought really hard to find this structure for ourselves and to get equality. This kind of emerging again into this new non-binary space is gonna, what's that gonna do? And I think we see lots of tension in there, particularly around the trans debate, particularly around trans women-only spaces. What does that mean? And if you fall on one side or the other of it, it is a very emotive and really clear issue that we can't grapple with, and there's no solution at the moment. So I don't think that there is going to be a moment where we have recognized, right, we found our space in non-binary space. We haven't done it, but there are things institutions can do. Institutions can think about their labels. They can think about what their representation. They can challenge themselves to be in their collecting strategies. They can create non-gendered spaces. So things like toilets. I mean, I'm always surprised in the 15 years how much I talk about toilets, but providing better, and the role of our civic spaces is to hold that debate and to champion and to challenge in a social justice way. But we've got to get the structure right for ourselves to hold that and to do it safely, and to do it by providing the right resources, using the right language, and challenging our own thinking. And if we don't bring difference in terms of thinking into our workplaces, we're not going to get there.
So I was happy that you talked about feminism, because we can see that at the moment there are a lot of questions about the place of women, the place of the gender, place of the race, and it brings a lot of movement in all the different fields, whether it be magazines or social, public how do you say that? Public places where people can, for example, go to the toilet. So it's a very interesting moment. And you were talking about the young generation, and I think that we can feel that the young generation, or part of it, is really interested in moving to a new way of thinking things. But on the other side, I think you have young generation, which is also very traditional, and they don't want things to be changed. So how do you see that? Because you don't have to forget that there is another point of view.
Well, this is exactly
still very very, very conservative, because all the young people are like, wow.
I think this is such an important point, because inclusion is not about selecting who you're going to represent. So inclusion is about responding to everybody. And I think probably from my view, too often civic spaces try to have one story that covers everybody. And actually what we need to be doing is telling multiple stories. So we need to be telling multiple stories so that more people are seeing themselves in those spaces. And it's not just this trying to funnel everything through some clean wall panels that can only have 100 words, or it's a marketing poster that can only have one image. You know, we've got to challenge ourselves to tell multiple stories, not just one. And we have to remember that we're here for our audience. Everything we do is actually about a person interacting with culture. No matter if that is in theatre, it's in an art gallery, it's on a wall, everything we're doing here is to advance the opportunity for more people to be engaged there. So if somebody can't see themselves in anywhere in your space, why would they come to you? Why would they come and see difference and they can't see themselves in the space? So it's the challenge. It is the challenge of saying, right, for our history, we all know our cultural history, and this is not, we could have a whole nother webinar about cultural histories. But, it is about when somebody is coming into your gallery, can they see themselves without a problem? Or do you have to go hunting for yourself? Can you use a facility that's safe? Can you be welcomed in a way that everybody else is being welcomed? So for me, it's not that inclusion should never be about a redistribution of the cherry pie. So I'm going to take from you, Olivier, that I want this because I need to take this from you for a living. It's about saying we're getting more cherry pies on the table, so everybody can be seen and can be heard.
It's very important to say it that way, so everybody understands it. So I'm going to go through the Q&A, and we have a question from Marie. She's wondering if you have any examples of exhibition that focuses on what masculinity is and how it is constructed. Well, I would say there is one, Marie, at the museum at the moment, but there might be others I'm not aware of. So you might say a few words about
the Barbican in London had a masculinities exhibition in photography. Just it closed last summer, but I think they have loads of stuff online around masculinities. That's in London. I think there's a lot out there around masculinities. I think I'm not very sure of what is open at the moment in culture. A lot of in the UK we are, everywhere is closed until May. But I think that there is lots of. I showed you the image of Keith Haring, and we were talking about masculinity when we were talking about Keith Haring. When we were talking about Aubrey Beardsley. We were talking about the dandy, and how do we tag the dandy, and where does the language historically come from, when actually what does this mean? So yeah, I don't know any more specifics, but Barbican had a great one that just very much focused on, and it was huge, really great exhibition, really full of photography.
Okay, well, we will have a look on the net to find more information about it. There was another question about the vintage clothing movement. So many LGBT people are part of this trend, vintage clothing, and they wear clothing that is far from neutral, that follow patterns of the past. But are vintage fans wearing really following patterns of the past, or are vintage fans backwards because we lack the elegance of the past? What do you think about that?
Well, that is I mean, it's not. I will put in, I can only talk from my personal view here and respond to general culture. I'm not a fashion expert. That's not. I definitely don't think that's what my invitation was here today. I guess there is. There is something about reclaiming, and what does that mean? That is a bigger ethical conversation. And for example, for Queer British Art, we did a lot of work around finding clothing and objects that were representative of the queer community. And one of those such objects was the Oscar Wilde's prison door. So we had a prison door sat next to a portrait of Oscar Wilde. Now, an institution making that selection, what does that mean about the idea of surfacing the door, prison, the trauma of that time? But actually also, is it about the fact that without that, we are where we are today? Now, I can talk about vintage fashion. Maybe you can, Olivia, because, but you know, for me, there are moments where we will always be in a cycle of looking backwards and looking backwards to observe the lens of today. What we can't, I think we may struggle to do is, and this is some of the biggest challenges, is using today's lens to look backwards. And applying today our ethics, our values, our representation of who we are today to something that might have happened in 1865 or 1955. You know, that's going to be our newest challenge in tempering and holding that debate in a very kind of balanced way.
So you were talking about history and the lens of the way we see things, and there is a question about if there has been another period in time where gender and binary and non-binary persons were questioned, or is it the first time in the history that we really facing this debate?
I think it's interesting because there's no way that we've just manifested this debate in the last 20 years. There's just no way that we've just created this debate for ourselves. I think language is what has played the predominant role there. So one of the reasons queer British art went up to a very specific date of 1961 is because that was the point in which homosexuality became illegal. Became legal, sorry. So up until that point, there had been kind of laws are against it. People had their belongings destroyed. People would lose their jobs. But within that period, that historical period, there is gender fluidity. There is gender nonconformity. There is images or conversations of othering, of other groups that are out there. Now, they may have not had the same language in which we use it today, such as queer. What they might have called it was the dandy. Is probably a good example of that. And even when we were looking back, that lens of, all right, we want to show this lens today, we want to talk to a 2020 audience, but actually the artists themselves didn't use terminology like non-binary or pronouns or things that we might be considering as modern thinking. But then also culturally, we have to realize actually it's quite a westernized thing where we talk about binary sex models. It comes from science, it comes from Western science. There is many cultures which have multiple genders, different ways in which people operate in those cultures. Hawaii, I think, has something up to 7 different forms of gender. So those are the complications that we're operating in when we're trying to think about this today, is that westernization, the language that people we would talk about it. So even when we're researching it, they might be talking about the same things, but they're using a very different language. And I'm definitely not going to be talking like I'm an anthropologist, but that's the type of things that modern anthropologists are looking at.
Okay. 2 last questions. Going back to fashion, the question is about, according to you, does the revolution can be led by new designers, or can it be brought by already existing brands that are at the moment binary and from the fashion world or the luxury world? So do you think that existing brands, they can make their self-revolution, or there must be some new ones with new designers?
So this is where I think it gets a bit difficult, because ultimately those are businesses. Whilst we may be saying that we're talking from a museum and a gallery, an archival kind of approach for that history, fashion houses are businesses. So they have an ultimate, until those consumers want that, till those magazines want that in their magazine, they're probably going to not change because they've got a model of which they're operating in.
Yeah.
And until that affects the bottom line of those businesses, there isn't going to be a radical shift. Now, I might be wrong. Like, there might be wrong that all of a sudden you have a huge leader who's going to come into a strong fashion house and say, right, we're going to totally change everything we're doing and go a whole different direction, and it will be supported. Probably, if you look at the history of when there's been too much of a pivot in fashion, and people fall out of that success quite quickly. So I think it will become when the consumer wants it, and that's going to be a while off yet. And that consumer, there are multiple consumers. It's not going to be because of a social justice reason. It's going to be because actually it's good business to do it. Mm-hmm. And I don't want to go on record if I think that will happen or not, because I don't want the fashion world to come for me. But I think that's the challenge, and it's different for a museum and gallery, which is an archival and has more responsibility to educate and to be social justice minded. But if you're a business, your objectives don't have that same approach.
So if we go back to the last question, and it's about museums and gallery, and the question is about, for example, the Tate Gallery, how does diversity and inclusion happen in practice? Are you organizing focus groups? Are you regularly meeting with representatives from various groups, or do you learn about the multiple stories we want to tell? So how does the education part of the museum deals with those aspects?
Yeah, I mean, I no longer work at Tate Art Galleries. I work somewhere else now, but I would say Tate Art Galleries is very much investing in and working through with diversity and inclusion to challenge its own histories and its own challenges. There's a number of projects, there's a number of exhibitions it has done. So what I would say is there are 3 things that happen around diversity and inclusion in a cultural institution. One is the exhibition process. So that exhibition, the process of making an exhibition requires lots of people with different thoughts, different processes. And I think what Tate is doing really well is thinking about, right, how do we set up focus groups? Who are we talking to? And they have 4 amazing staff networks. So where staff with a shared equality characteristic come together and say, look, we're here, you can come and ask us what we think about it. We can support you with accessing network, and we can challenge you to say that's not quite good enough now in 2021. Then there's a focus on the workforce, because you can do all of these things, but if you still have a predominantly white, predominantly male, predominantly cisgendered workforce, and that's not to take away from white men, but we have to have equality and good representation of everybody. But if you have a dominant overrepresented group, the workforce has to be focused on in a way of it becoming more reflective of the communities you're serving. So that means at every level. So working through, and that means looking at recruitment, it's looking at the job opportunities, it's looking at when you have a funded project, and it's looking at when you're moving into somewhere new, that you're really holding really strong diversity sort of benchmarks. Now, I know some of the challenges around workforce, and particularly around asking about identity, is really challenging in Brussels. I appreciate that. I spent many a time with colleagues in Brussels and Amsterdam and trying to sort of support through that question. But it doesn't mean that we can't push and take learnings from those who can have access to that data, and that's some of the key things. And then the last area is about audience. So how do you communicate to audiences, this is what you're trying to do? And that's not going to happen through one queer exhibition. That's through your learning programs, it's through the marketing, it's through your social media accounts. It's really engaging audiences in a much wider sense. And what I think Tate are doing really well with is that a lot of their strategy isn't about, right, okay, we want X number of queer people attending this or represented, or we don't, it is about thinking about strong pillars where there is strong diversity already. So it's saying we want more young people. So if we want more young people, we're going to have to think about diverse identities. And what does that mean? If we want more local to our venues, we're going to have to think about, because they will naturally be more diverse. And then we want more families. Families are always driving, have always been the driving seat for diversity. As parents become activated for their children, families are changing. Families are more diverse. So that for me is where they're going to really be striving, and they'll be able to draw upon that to deal with the kind of 500 years of history which they also had to work through.
Well, thank you very much for this very interesting presentation and Q&A. I think we've been talking a lot and covering a lot of different topics, and I think people have now a few things to think about, and I hope me and everybody can see things with different eye, and thinking about inclusion and gender equality and masculinity, femininity with another perspective. So thank you very much, James, for this talk, and thank you to the audience for being here for this first Leçon Mode in English. So it's been a success, I think. So thank you.
Brilliant. Thanks, everybody.
Bye-bye, everybody. Thanks.